Hi, this is Random Rob. Welcome back to the new show. Who can forget the immortal lines? Do not attempt to adjust your television set. We are controlling transmission. Tonight I'm talking about The Outer Limits. The original Outer Limits, which ran from 1963 to 1965. The Outer Limits was created by screenwriter Joseph Stefano and producer Leslie Stevens. Stefano had gained notoriety a few years earlier by writing the screenplay for Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, and had an idea for doing a modern horror show. Producer Leslie Stevens was interested in doing hard science kind of stories. And between the two of them, they came up with a show that was an interesting hybrid of the two. And in fact, one of the only real science fiction horror anthology shows that was ever done. And it wasn't just that The Outer Limits was a sci-fi horror show, it's that it was really a sci-fi horror noir show, especially in its first season. It was also, unfortunately, a show that was like Space 1999's second season and like Star Trek's third season. The Outer Limits was killed in its second season. Stefano was pushed out of his role of producer. A new producer named Brady was brought in, who wanted to give the show a kind of lighter tone. It was moved out of its time slot in prime time during the week to later Saturday nights. And the problem was that the show was very popular with younger people, and not as many of them were watching on Saturdays, and the show was actually pulled about halfway through its second season because of poor ratings, which is a sad ending to a program that had such a prestigious start. So mostly, I want to talk about the first season of The Outer Limits. What's most striking when you watch The Outer Limits now is how clear and strong a tone it set for the material it was doing. Very serious, it was very dark. And I don't just mean that the themes were dark, it was visually dark. Many of the show's best episodes were photographed by Gerd Oswald, who had been a director of photography who worked for F.W. Murnau, photographing some of his most famous silent films. The show is full of the intense photography that German silent film had. Lots of Dutch angles, lots of extreme close-ups, photographing using a fisheye lens, and always very dramatic lighting and shadows. And it wasn't just that, it was that The Outer Limits in its first season didn't really hold the audience's hand that much about explaining the science or trying to make the material lighthearted. It was really quite different from most science fiction genre shows that had come before it, and was much closer in tone to the more popular social commentary cinema and television of the day. You know, the late 50s and early 60s in American television and cinema was marked by a period of social concern, showing dramatic situations from different POVs, incorporating more female points of view, incorporating more minority points of view. And often, the point of these kinds of shows and films was to kind of jar the audience, to get them to think about something. Very different from television that would come after. In some ways, The Outer Limits made people uncomfortable. It definitely made some of the television executives uncomfortable after the first season, which is why they chose to lighten it up and kick it into another time slot. But it's interesting to note that such a dark show was most popular with a younger audience. In essence, what the show had in its first season was a Kennedy-era vibe to it. A feeling that prosperity might be making America a little too content, and that with all the advances that were being made in science and all the social changes that were happening in the world, Americans needed to think more deeply about things. So almost every episode of The Outer Limits contained some kind of moral question in it that would usually be set up beautifully by the narrator, Vic Perrin, and would usually tie it up at the end with a really nice closing speech. The show often dealt with the dark side of human nature. The aliens in The Outer Limits would often show up to point up a human problem. whether it was racism or being overly aggressive or not understanding something in nature well enough or encountering the difficulties that would come from communicating with an alien species. The show was also groundbreaking in that there were a number of actors who appeared on the show who had been blacklisted during the House Un-American Activities Commission under Joe McCarthy. And this was one of their first chances to work again. And in the case of the brilliant episode Obit, actor Jeff Corey, who had been a decorated combat photographer in the Korean War, who had been blacklisted, got a chance in this episode to sound off about McCarthyism. In fact, the whole episode of Obit is about McCarthyism and the surveillance state. To me, probably the best single episode of the series, and one of the best single hours of television that came out of America in the 20th century, in my opinion. The first season had wonderful music, too. Composed by Dominic Frontier and Robert Van Epps. Just spine-tingling horror music with great little bits of atonality in them. Lovely romantic themes. The music for the second season was composed by Harry Lubin and often featured a theremin. It's one of several issues I have with second season episodes of the show, is the music just sounds very dated and corny, whereas the first season music still sounds good. I can't say that enough, how everything in the first season of that show really worked to create a moody, dark, film noir tone that has rarely been done in science fiction since, and is due for a comeback. The Outer Limits also featured some wonderful creature designs by sculptor Chang, who would later go on to design props for Star Trek. In fact, Gene Roddenberry actually cannibalized several costumes and props from the Outer Limits that show up in Star Trek if you look closely. Another factor that contributed to Season 1's very specific feel was the fact that Joseph Stefano, who wrote most of the scripts, had been going through Freudian analysis at the time, and was writing down his dreams and turning them into screenplays, and is turning them into stories. And some of it's quite nightmarish. The Outer Limits is really the first TV show I can remember that had body horror. For example, in the episode Corpus Earthling, where alien virus creatures that are masquerading as rocks turn into these little Cthulhu tentacle creatures and grab this doctor's hand and then jump up onto his face. Very clear precursor to the facehugger from Alien. Or the episode The Invisibles, about an underground terrorist group that's infecting high-ranking members of the government with parasitic alien life forms. And this was 1963. And I should mention, if you're interested in The Outer Limits, or you watch it and you like it, I can't recommend this book, The Outer Limits Companion by David S. Schow? Schow? I think that's Schow. This is just a fantastic book. It's got all sorts of production photographs and drawings and stories by cast members and crew. If you're a fan of the show, it's a must-have. Nice big coffee table book. I love this book. Yeah, The Outer Limits. The best science fiction horror show of its kind. Now I wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. I don't know if any of you follow me on social media, but I have closed my social media accounts again. I took a 6-month hiatus from it this year and tried to get back online for a few months, and I just can't do it. I was watching one of John Green's videos on a similar subject where he was saying something to the effect of, social media is fine for some people, but it's not fine for me. I feel the same way. I tend to binge on it, get into validation seeking, and it just always makes me feel yucky. And just in general, yeah, the medium, it's just a little too toxic for me. I'm of course going to keep my YouTube channel. I'm also putting my short fiction up on Tumblr. You can look that up. It's under R.W. Chambers Me. But yeah, I've just got to take a break from social media. just don't like the way it makes me feel. So anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed my talk about the outer limits. Please hit the like button and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next week on the new show. Thanks for watching. Bye.